Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. The conventional wisdom is that America's college campuses are getting more diverse. But is that really the case? Some are becoming more white and Asian and less black and Latino. Black colleges are gaining in popularity. What does this mean for our schools, and what does it mean for America? Joining us are Ronald Walters, professor of political science at the University of Maryland and author of Black Presidential Politics in America, and Tamar Jacoby, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and author of Someone Else's House, America's Unfinished Struggle for Integration. The topic before the House: are colleges getting less diverse? This week on Think Tank. American universities are becoming more and more diverse. Integration seems to be commonplace, yet it is by no means a clear picture.
Education is our fight! Education is our right!
In California, the passage of Proposition 209 eliminated preferences based on race. At the flagship campus of the University of California at Berkeley, the number of blacks applying and attending the school has dropped, but other campuses have seen increases. Some schools are purposefully non-diverse. Historic black colleges such as Howard University in Washington, D.C. have long and illustrious reputations. But over recent decades, such schools have suffered as mainstream universities and colleges stepped up their recruiting of minorities. Now, interest in black colleges is on the rise again. At issue is not just integration on campus, but interaction. Are minority groups sticking to themselves in specialized student centers and dormitories? If so, why? And finally, what about non-campus life? Is America itself becoming more or less integrated? And by the way, at a time when the black middle class is growing, does it matter as much as it once did? Tamar Jacoby, Ron Walters, welcome. Ron, you're an old hand here. Why don't you begin? Just tell us briefly what the role of the historically black colleges are in America.
Well, I think, Ben, when you go back, you have to conclude that right after the Civil War, these institutions were born to satisfy a thirst for higher education among blacks, and that without these institutions having started since that time, they really would not have had a black middle class. So that if you look at the top stratum of our leadership, predominantly they've come from these institutions. So that they have been very important in education, but also when you look at various communities around the country, you conclude that they're also important in the institutional structure of these communities and the economic development as employers, as people who let contracts. So they're very vital to the total life of the black community.
Tamar, you just spent how many years on a book?
7.
7 years on a book in which you did extensive interviewing in 3 main cities, Atlanta, New York, and Detroit.
Correct.
What is your impression of how the black community regards black colleges these days?
Well, there's no question there's a huge reverence for the black colleges for historical reasons, the reasons that Ron describes. And also there's been an upswing in interest in black colleges, paradoxically, as the larger society becomes more open and we kind of get closer to that ideal of one community. There's also been this paradoxical moving back to interest in being among one's own and being in a setting, an all-black setting, that I think is somewhat troubling. Important to understand what it comes from, but somewhat troubling. If we're aiming for one integrated community, what's the role of colleges?
Isn't that happening not just in the black community, but I mean, I see it in the Jewish community, where people thought it was going to be total assimilation, and now suddenly people who went to public schools are now sending their kids to Jewish schools, to Jewish day schools. all, I mean, it's not balkanization, they're not non-American or anything like that, but they're just seeking to establish identities in this pluralist democracy.
I think you're right, and I think that there is no necessary problem here with people going to an institution which expresses their culture. Because if you look at these people, what they do is they come out and they make a contribution to the relatively integrated life of America. I mean, you've got a Vernon Jordan who went to a Morehouse, who now is in a largely white law firm and one of the top black leaders in this country. So you can see that pattern where the institutions produce them, but they don't stay in a cul-de-sac.
But the question to me is one of balance. I mean, no one who understands what makes America great can doubt the role of group loyalty, but there also has to be a balancing sense of a common identity and what we all have in common. And I think in America today we're kind of got the balance wrong. It's gotten out of balance. We've forgotten what we all have in common and what brings us together.
Well, but I'm not so sure. One quick point I would make is that we ought to keep clear about the fact that the trend in higher education has been for young people to be found in integrated institutions. I mean, that is the trend. That is continuing. There are only about 25% of young black students in HBCUs.
HBCU stands
historically black colleges.
And I bet Vernon Jordan, if he was going to college today, would not end up in a historically black college.
He probably wouldn't.
He'd be at Harvard.
He probably would.
He'd be seeking opportunity and seeking
that's the point
richness of the commingling.
But
that's the point I'm making.
There are some very bright and excellent black students who could get in anywhere who are choosing to go to historically black colleges.
Yes, as a matter of fact, 2 years ago, Howard University had 32 National Merit Scholars.
Really?
Yes. And I think that when entering freshman class, and I think that when you look at these institutions, they are not just sort of producers of talent, they are institutions which reflect a certain culture. They're institutions which find that young people have a value in wanting to go to them because they do want to further that culture, and I think that's sort of a natural thing.
But I think it's also a symptom of how the bigger integration doesn't work. Blacks still don't feel at home many blacks still don't feel at home in a mainstream black college and maybe aren't welcomed there. And so it's a symptom of something that isn't working.
Yeah.
You know, if the King Dream had been realized, I think by now, the way we all hoped, there wouldn't be that need for the protective enclave.
How long did you teach at Howard?
I was at Howard 24 years.
Whoa.
Wow.
You were chairman of the political science department?
I was the chairman of the political science department, and they were some of the best years of my life, no question about it. But let me say that...
And now you're at the University of Maryland.
That's right. Now I'm at the University of Maryland.
But why did you leave Howard?
Well, I think a combination of a number of things. One is that I looked at the last third of my career and thought that I wanted to be in a bit richer research environment. I have a number of books, as you know, I'm writing. And I think that this sort of resources to do that exist in an institution like Maryland. There's 32,000 students and a fairly rich array of resources from survey research to other kinds of things. And so that was attractive. But I must say that Howard also had it as a new administration. And sometimes when a new administration comes in, that's probably the best time to go.
Are black faculty members at black colleges being wooed and recruited by state universities, by private institutions, and is therefore the quality of the faculty in black universities diminishing?
Yes, I would say that one of the striking things I found at the University of Maryland, and I found at other institutions, is that there is a group of people who were formerly at these institutions who are now at Maryland and other institutions. Their places are being taken up many times by immigrant intellectuals who come and assume that role.
Well, the question
from Africa or Asia,
who are teaching in the black
who
colleges.
are teaching in the black colleges.
The question to me, too, if you were a black student facing the choice, would not just be the quality of the resources, which is obviously important, but what kind of preparation is one going to get for the world that lies beyond? And if it's not going to be learning how to be at ease with other kinds of people, you know, what's going to happen when your first day on the job, you're not only facing the job, but you're facing the first time you've ever had to interact with white people?
Yeah, but there are good studies which show that there's really no problem there. That students in historically black colleges and universities have had no trouble And all you have to do is look at the recruiters who come to places like Howard University and Spelman and Morehouse in droves.
Well, they're obviously very able people.
No question, but I'm saying that there has been no problem.
That's the cream of the crop of the black colleges that you're talking about. I mean, those are wonderful schools.
That's right.
But Tamar, let me ask you this: in a mainstream university, you have Jewish fraternities.
Sure.
Now you're saying, gee, wouldn't it be wonderful if everybody, and black fraternities, wouldn't it be wonderful if everybody got together? In a lot of these universities, you're pledged in your first term of your freshman year, second term.
Again, I'm talking about balance.
Yeah, and I mean, does a Jewish fraternity distress you? You said black colleges were sort of
No,
disturbing.
Jewish fraternity doesn't distress me, or a black fraternity doesn't distress me, but I think the administration of the college should not be paying for the Jewish fraternity or the Jewish dorm or the Asian theme house. And that administration should be holding out an alternative that isn't just saying, we encourage you to explore your groupishness. They should be saying, we encourage you to come together in a common sphere and see these academic values, these American values, these human values that have nothing to do with your group, that will balance it out.
But that happens.
Not enough.
No, I think that's a relative judgment that you make. Because if you go on the ordinary college campus, what you'll find is that the day really is spent of the average student, no matter what their race or ethnicity, in situations that are relatively integrated, in classes, if they belong to a theater club or whatever it is they belong to. All of those situations are relatively integrated. Now when they socialize, when they come in the evening, yes, they may come into a black dorm, or when they want to do something special in terms of their culture, or when a speaker comes, they may want to do that. But for most of their academic, the hours that they spend in relatively integrated situations.
You spend more time on campus than I do, but the little I've seen, even in classes, black students sit apart. In the cafeteria, black students sit apart. I mean, it's been going on since I was in college a long time ago.
But I think that raises a very interesting question, intellectual question. I was at Harvard, spring of '89, the Kennedy Fellow. And, you know, they make you live in the dormitory. Every evening I had to come by, and I saw the students there studying. Asian students were often studying together, and I had a chance to talk to them. Well, what are they doing? What they're doing was they were using their culture to manipulate a very complex institution and be successful. I thought that there was nothing wrong with that. I thought there was nothing wrong with the black students doing the same thing. So I think we have to give them sort of the space that they need, you know, to do those things, because that helps them to be successful in the institution, because many of them are hostile places.
What about things that I'm sure would drive Tamar up the wall, like black studies programs, where the case can be made that you'd have a setup then that blacks and whites within a mainstream public university are learning sort of two versions of history. Does that disturb you?
No, it doesn't disturb me, because as I was about to say, I think the intellectual question is, what do you really mean by integration? And I think some people think that if there's not a melange equally distributed in the institution or around the table or so forth, it's not integrated. I would argue with that. I would argue that some of the most successful integrations comes about as a result of people being comfortable in their own cultural setting, and so comfortable that they're able then to go out and with confidence participate in other people's culture.
I don't disagree with you, but again, it's about just what the balance is and where the public emphasis is, what the larger culture, what the mainstream culture encourages as our attitudes. And I think the larger culture now encourages us to think that we're all basically different and that we'll never really have anything in common with the other, and that the only kind of interaction we have is a kind of wary, peaceful coexistence, not a sense of really belonging together to one community. And that, I think, that's not a balance. That's off.
But Tamar, I think that's a little, just a touch overdrawn. And the reason I think that is because if you look at American popular culture, what you see is really a gumbo. People call it a salad, I call it a gumbo. Bits and pieces of it coming from every corner, conceivable corner of this country. And I think that is a coming really over time, a coming together of the cultures, maybe even in a superficial way, but it certainly represents, I think, a sort of integrated existence of many of these groups. I think also one other way that you can test that is the increasing test scores. When you look at black youngsters, they've had 27% increase in test scores over the last 7 years.
In their grade level.
In their grade level.
Wow.
And
Grade
looking
level
at,
or SAT score?
looking at the SAT scores, looking at these tests, what you're beginning to see is a change in the composition of these tests to reflect American culture. And as they change them, then what happens is that all of the kids do better.
I agree with you about what's out there, but I think people's attitudes is still lagging behind that. Where there's, on the part of a lot of black kids, what I hear is, mainstream America is a white culture, and on the part of a lot of white people, college kids and others, black Americans are different. It's a black thing you wouldn't understand. So I think you're objectively right about the culture out there, and I wish we could all recognize that. But I think that
Tamar has used that phrase. I've been checking the nexus in the record, some earlier articles, and in your book, she has used that T-shirt, "It's a black thing you wouldn't understand," as sort of a symbol of what is going on in the non-integration of the society that Dr. King dreamed of. Does that resonate with you, or does she have it wrong?
No,
she wouldn't understand. Right?
Well, let me put on my other hat now,
Right.
because I do think that she has a point in that America is, to some extent, more segregated today than it was when Dr. King was around. If you look at Gary Orfield's studies, Harvard University, of education and integration in education, the case he makes is that because many places are residentially more segregated and blacks more isolated, then the institutional patterns reflect that. So the demographers tell us that if you look at those tracts, those census tracts that are predominantly black, we have in some cities more of them today than we had when King was alive.
my emphasis is a little bit different. I think we've made a lot of progress in the kind of physical, socioeconomic, political realm. More blacks work alongside whites, for example. But it's that last little mile we haven't gone, where we really believe that we share in a common, again, I use the word community, a common culture, common enterprise, common nationality.
Let me ask you a question. Ron, you were sounding a minute ago like one of my prototypical neoconservative guests here, so talking about how you don't have to look at results-oriented kind of ratios in order to say some place is integrated. I mean, that's the whole argument about affirmative action, which is people say it doesn't have to be by the quota, by the number. You don't have to be preference. Let everybody alone, and people will gravitate to the places that they want to go to. Is that have you changed your view?
No, that's different.
We've been around this track a few times. Gotcha. Yeah,
No, that's a different question.
Why is that a different question?
That's a different question because affirmative action is an access question.
Is an access.
Yeah, we have been talking about what the institution looks like once you get in. But the issue is, how do you get in? Patterns of racism and discrimination in this country have been things that have excluded people from access. Affirmative action came along as a tool to provide access. These institutions we're talking about, employment and other places. So we don't want to confuse those two things. Affirmative action is a way of making it possible for people, once they get in, to enjoy whatever's there, and to do it in two ways: to enjoy their own culture and to enjoy the mainstream culture that's there.
You know, my view for the affirmative action is it gets kids into these colleges, but it doesn't prepare them to do the work they have to do when they get there. And, you know, we see this in the dropout rates. You know, the black attrition rate nationally, it's in the upward of 50% range. In places like Berkeley, it's double the white rate. And, you know, I would rather see programs that really prepare. I'd rather see a big national effort to really prepare kids to make it in these places, not a Band-Aid that kind of covers up the fact that they can't make it.
Well,
What I see happening in California is we're taking the Band-Aid off, and instead of people see what's underneath, and they're appalled, you know, a lot of black kids really can't compete at Berkeley and places like that, and instead of doing something about it, instead of let's go back and fix K through 12 and fix the attitude that says doing well in school is acting white and stuff like that, people are saying, oh no, put the Band-Aid back on before we have to face it. And
no,
I think that's unimaginable.
No, I wouldn't agree with you. I think we are long past the time when these youngsters can't make it in places like Berkeley. In fact, they can.
Well, look,
There were 800
What's the dropout
kids.
rate?
Let's talk about the dropout rate. Let me just say this.
Go ahead.
The dropout rate is a product of more than just intellectual failure. If you look at people, the studies at places like Fannie Mae that provide loans to kids, the dropout rate has a lot to do with economics. Kids can't stay because they don't have the money. Now, if you look at the total dropout rate, then you cover up the most dynamic factor in the dropout rate,
Well,
which is the low socioeconomic status of the family.
It's hard to know which is the most dynamic factor, isn't it? If a place like Berkeley, the black average SAT is almost 300 points below the average white SAT,
but in spite of that,
that's got to be some kind of factor in it too, doesn't it?
Yeah, but in spite of that, we know that these SAT scores do not predict academic success in these institutions. And despite them, these youngsters come out the other end. No, they don't. No, they don't.
Well, this is a much disputed area.
It is a profoundly disputed area.
I mean, I think you can quarrel about what they predict later, but the one thing they do predict is academic performance.
No, we can argue about that, but at the very least, I think you have to assume my point.
I
that
think
the total dropout rate
is part and part.
Right.
Let me ask a question here. I mean, Dr. Walters here is coming across as a very moderate sort of a soul, who I think I agree with his central point, which I take it to be things are not going too badly, and let everybody do their own thing. He'd be for some bending over backward thoughts that I might not accept, but you know, just leave people alone, which you as a neoconservative would approve of. And yet, your book seems to say, well, it's not going right when you leave it alone.
Because I don't think we've left it alone.
Somebody who, I don't know who the we is, we ought to do something about it. And Walters and I here are a united front saying, well, you know,
First of all, I'm not trying to accept the label neoconservative. That's the first thing. I don't like labels.
Okay,
and especially on race, it's tricky.
I accept it, but Ron doesn't.
But
right,
the point is, I don't think we are leaving it alone. I think the culture that's developed in the past 35 years, since King articulated the dream of one community, has been a culture that basically doesn't believe in one community, that believes the ideal is peaceful coexistence and kind of mistrust. We've embraced the mistrust of the past 300 years as a way we want to live, rather than moving beyond it and saying we can do better. And so I'm not saying we government, or I'm just saying that our assumptions, all of our assumptions are skewed.
We are running out of time. Let me ask a final question. Ron Walters, or Tamar, I forget who, used the word mistrust. Is the amount of mistrust between whites and blacks growing, or diminishing, staying the same?
I think it's growing. I think that many of the assumptions of the civil rights movement were that America would stand still long enough for us to achieve the dream of integration that Martin Luther King Jr. had. 30 years later, we know that this is not the case. America has not stood still, and the political climate has changed to the point where now blacks are feeling beset upon, that the distrust really is growing, rather than I think really coming down from that civil rights period. It seems as though that there's an irony here, that the closer you get to it, the more blacks you put out in the middle class, the more opportunity that is given to or earned by minorities, the more they come closer to equality, the more whites recoil and therefore defend themselves and their position in society. And therefore the bridges of mistrust really are broken and the barriers go back up.
More mistrust?
I think the mistrust is growing, but it's a more complicated picture and for different reasons than Ron suggests. Blacks and whites are getting to know each other. We are getting together at work. We do sit next to each other at school. There is a black middle class. When people get to know each other and work next to each other, they gradually get over their mistrust. When they come together for common purposes, they get over their mistrust, and that's happening. But I believe that there's a kind of a level above that where the culture is telling us to mistrust each other. The culture is telling us we're all different and we can never really learn to get along. And it is partly racism on the white side, it's partly indifference on the white side, and it's partly alienation and anger on the black side. And that's encouraging a mistrust that's getting in the way of that getting to know each other.
Okay. Thank you, Tamar Jacoby and Ron Walters, and thank you. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
We at Think Tank depend on your views to make our show better. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. or email us at thinktank@pbs.org. To learn more about Think Tank, visit PBS online at www.pbs.org. And please let us know where you watch Think Tank.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.